Yeah, what is the problem that is happening right now with Christian apologists and the Pentateuch, the documentary hypothesis
of the Bible? You can see the sources at work there.
That everyone, without a shadow of a doubt, agrees with. They just argue over the minutia detail of what is what. Is the documentary hypothesis it?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about Christian apologist. I was a minor version of a Christian apologist. I was working under a guy named Thomas McCuddy at a small little, school here in North Carolina. And Thomas McCuddy was kind of a disciple of people in the vein of Ravi Zacharias and guys like that. I'm not saying that they owned any massage parlors. I'm just saying that, they worked in the same vein. I know that was that was definitely
I shouldn't laugh. I really shouldn't.
You shouldn't. I know it's silly. But seriously, these apologists seem to be performing confirmation bias on everything that they have to, of course, defend what's sacred to them, and that is the Bible. And so the documentary hypothesis, especially the renewed versions, seem to better make sense of the sources that are in the Old Testament, development of the Pentateuch and whatnot. And so I found your channel. I was recommended to it by Camille Greger, and then, of course, my friend Stephen Nelson, and they both love paying attention to the McPologist, the McGrew, McClatchy. These are Christian apologists. And then, of course, we see Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. They're always putting out something to try to get the skeptics to look like they're just fabricating evidence. They don't know what they're talking about. And you dealt with the documentary hypothesis. So I said, please, Dr. Davies, come on. Let's deal with this. I didn't say Dr. Davis because I didn't know you were a doctor, but notice how I anachronistically did that. That was an anachronism. Anyway, what do we have? What's the problem that we have going on?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, what is the problem that is happening right now with Christian apologists and the Pentateuch, the documentary hypothesis? Okay,
so I mean, there's lots to unpack here. So I'm just gonna go. And I think, for me personally, it's in the construction of the Pentateuch, in the documentary hypothesis, that I really started to push my own personal beliefs as a Christian in another direction entirely. And I think for apologists and for evangelicals, it's a very strong direct challenge to the doctrine of inerrancy, and that's why it's something that they feel the need to defend against, to attempt to counter-explain. Problematically for them, though, the evidence, and I hoped I showed that in particular in my last video, the evidence is just so strong. And I mean, even in that video, I was frantically trying to cut it down and still ended up with an hour of material. And I was just feeling like I'm just barely scraping the surface here of everything that I could say about why scholars find it so compelling. And I think something that that tends to get lost too. You could totally see, even just reading your English translation of the Bible, you can see the sources at work there. I mean, I assume you've gone through this and you've seen it, right? But what I find is that it's not as easy to see it as it is when you're looking at the Hebrew text too. Because English translators will make choices with regards to how they render certain words or certain phrases, and they're not always consistent in doing so. And so one of the things I wanted to do, in particular in that last video, was try and show that, from a perspective of the Hebrew text in particular, how there's things that you don't see in the English that show me or show another Hebrew reader that, yeah, I mean, there's really a dramatic difference between what's happening in this source, P, the priestly source, and in this source, J, the Yahweh source. When I teach Old Testament, and when any class in the Old Testament, something that I'm very deliberate in doing is in ensuring that the names for God, Yahweh, Elohim, El Shaddai, are not translated into their English counterparts. It's very important to retain those when teaching the text, when reading the text, because, as you know, because of the rabbinic sensitivities to the name of God, it sort of was inherited by the first English translators and the reformers, who made the choice when translating the Tetragrammaton Yahweh, decided to render that into English as the Lord in all caps. So all of our English Bibles, wherever it says Yahweh in the text, it says the Lord. And growing up in the church, growing up in evangelical, I mean, this is the sort of thing that I just never paid any attention to, and I never noticed. And it just looked like a different way of referring to the same God when it's just not. These are I guess, I mean, yes, it's a different way of referring to the same God in Hebrew in a sense, but the whole rationale behind that is just completely lost in our English translations of the text. Huh. So, and there is actually, like, there's passages in the Hebrew Bible where people will refer to God as Lord, Adonai. So it's one of those things. I decided this early on, when I'm teaching classes, I am going to insist on this. When my students write papers, I'm going to insist on this. Identify God properly as the text identifies him. So either as Yahweh or as El or as Elohim. And I find that that's one of those things where it's sort of like a first step in helping you to see the differences in the sources. But it's one of those things that's just also really easily glossed over.
So real quick, in the vein of this, the documentary hypothesis is one. I got one question on that. And then, of course, the names of God seem to be the older way of explaining the different sources. And it's not the only way, even though that may play a role to some degree on, are we looking at priestly? Are we looking at a Deuteronomic? Are we looking at, what are we looking at? That seems to be the vein in which the older versions, I think, of the documentary hypothesis were going. But my first question, and then, of course, we can lead to the second idea, is the documentary hypothesis the main hypotheses of explaining the source material across the board consensus from all experts on the Old Testament? Like, if you were to say, this is the theory, or if you will, hypothesis, that everyone without a shadow of a doubt agrees with, they just argue over the minutia detail of what is what, is the documentary hypothesis it?
Absolutely. And it's something that everybody, like when you're going through your studies and training in religious studies or biblical, it's something that everybody has to deal with. Everybody learns it. Everybody learns the evidence for it. And in my experience, and I should say, like, this isn't my area of specialization. I really like Pentateuchal narrative, and lots of apologetic stuff is centered around the documentary hypothesis. So this is something that interests me. But in my experience, and going to conferences and in speaking with academics and reading books and articles, it's absolutely entrenched. Like, it is a part of current scholarship, and it has been for a very long time. And like you said, there's lots of dispute about the minutia.
Right.
In the European schools, which is where I was, there's lots of there's been a movement for a while to resurrect something similar to what we called the supplementary, or sorry, the fragmentary hypothesis or the supplementary hypotheses. But all of this stuff still, and this is what I think is the important point, all of these theories and all of the theories that sort of circulate the formation of the Pentateuch, there's not one that says the like all the books of the Pentateuch were written by the same author, or even each individual book, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, was written by. So I think the important point is that the overwhelming scholarly consensus is that there are sources in the Pentateuch, and that many of the sources are readily identifiable, and it absolutely destroys any notion that this is something that could have been written by Moses. And I think, moreover, it rather destroys the notion that that there was some sort of established text prior to the Babylonian exile.
Interesting. You know, I like this. This destroys inerrant infallibility as well. I mean, obviously, this is going to show how can you rectify contradictory sources and make them try to be one coherent, cohesive narrative. And, you know, Dr. Price, I interview him all the time. He said, no, I'm glad it's not inerrant infallible. And we have this because this picture, you know, people want to answer or ask the question, why? You know, why would they put two of these things together that are contradictory? And one speculative explanation is, well, look, they saw multiple traditions as sacred, so they kept multiple traditions. It wasn't an issue for the redactor to put this stuff together like we think today. Oh, no, it must make absolute logical sense. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites could both sell Joseph, and like, you know, like they didn't think that way. And so maybe that thinking, we aren't thinking like they thought. And it's important to try and understand why the redactors would do this, what's going on.
Oh, totally.
What are these apologists doing? I've heard Dr. Michael Heiser, I've interviewed him on my channel before on his book, Demons. And as a skeptic, of course, I don't think he even knew that I was a skeptic when I interviewed him. I just had a really cool, amazing dialogue and talked to him about like the biblical Nephilim and the giants and how, yes, these are not humans. They are portrayed as these big, angelic, if you will, or gods, mini Elohim, these little gods. And we had this great dialogue, but I found a YouTube video where he rejects the documentary hypothesis. And I thought, how can a Hebrew scholar like him and someone who is entrenched in the scholarship, or supposed to be, literally go on air on YouTube and say, I totally disagree with this, without trying to hold on to inerrancy? It's weird. So can you address these apologists?
I saw that in, and that was news to me too. That was a surprise when I saw that in your video about Heiser. And I think what it comes down to, like, when you read some, this is a fairly popular textbook used in very, very conservative schools for teaching the Old Testament, right? And what they tend to do is they spend a lot of time developing counter arguments to the documentary hypothesis, which center on the literary construction, or the literary artistry, or the literary features of the text, which would suggest that it's a unified document. And in my experience, most of this comes from the fact that somebody did at some point in time put these things together and had to make a bunch of decisions. about what to include and what to. I mean, because they couldn't include everything. You brought up the Joseph story as a great example where you can see the two different sources at work, and not in just the selling of whether it was the Ishmaelites who sold to whom Joseph was sold, or the Midianites. You'll notice in one story, Joseph's father is consistently called Jacob. In the other story, he's consistently called Israel. You know, one story is about Joseph, who has these fantastic dreams of grandeur. The other story is about Joseph, who has this technicolored garment that his father gifted to him. So both stories are about the jealousy of his brothers, but when you smash them together, it becomes like super jealousy. It's so like there's all these extra things. There's all this other stuff within just this one story, which shows that there's two different sources at work here. But like whoever put them together had to make some decisions about how to weave them together. Otherwise, it would have just been like a completely credulous, impossible story to tell. Right? Right. It's like I like looking at when I'm looking at and trying to divide the sources. A good way to do this, or a profitable area of the text to see this, is in genealogies. Because they tend to be highly formulaic, and as a result, you can really see very clearly like the different formulas that different authors are using to construct their genealogies. But when there's a combined genealogy, like in Genesis chapter 10, which is a genealogy, it's like two versions of the same genealogy. The editor couldn't just repeat everything. He had to kind of pick and choose. So he's like, okay, I'm going to pick bits from this one and then bits from this one, and kind of structure them together so that it still makes some coherent sense. But, a careful reader is going to be able to see, well, there's one voice here and there's another voice here, and they take turns speaking. And there's kind of like these linchpin passages that you'll find in there too, where you can see the editor is maybe struggling a little bit with how to sort of stitch those seams together. Right. But it's in the places I find where the redactor does some of his work. These tend to be the places where evangelicals and apologists will point to and go, oh, look, the text is beautiful. There's this literary coherence, and you can't achieve that if you pull the text apart. This is something in the video that I responded to of Michael Jones. I'm going to be in the next one. I'm going to be just going through his argument for internal consistency and showing all the problems with it. But what he does fairly consistent, one of the things he does fairly consistently is points to these places in the text where there's like this narrative continuity and this artist. He pulls up and he does all this stuff very quickly. I mean, you've seen a bunch of his stuff, and something that he does is he'll throw up all these arguments, right? But they're so fast, and he'll just kind of throw them out there. Like he spends, I think it's like 10 or 15 seconds in his video where he shows an image of a chiastic structure that a scholar thinks he sees in the entire flood story from Genesis 6 all the way through to Genesis 9. He just kind of throws this up on the screen. He's like, here's a great big chiasm that, you can't, you know, this is impossible if you pull the text apart. So he depends on these sorts of arguments. But when you get right down to it and you actually sit and go through the chiasm that he's put up there. For those of you who don't know, a chiasm is a poetic device where a writer will build in opposite pairs and of statements or themes, lots of times based on the usage of individual words. And they'll go in a pattern where they start, you know, statement A, then B, then C, and then C again, then B, then A. So it's like a reversal, right? And these are real.
One's kind of chiastic. I mean, you've got day 1 matches day 5 in some respects, day 2 and day 1, day 4, day 2, day 5, day 3, day 6. And if you look, one is you know, the land, and then you got land animals. So you got one is the sky, and then you got birds, and then one is the sea, and so. A
true chiasm would have been reversed, though, right? Where day 1, it would have been like day 1 would have been sky, but then day 6 would have been sky, right? Where it goes. So these are real. And you see them, like there's some neat ones in the Psalms. Usually the ones that I find convincing are pretty small, like restricted to a few verses. I've seen scholarly arguments attempting to do this for like huge chunks of text, like the flood story, right? So the one that Jones puts up on the screen, it's like 22 opposite pairs of thematic statements, and some of them, when you actually sit down and you look at the text, it's like one of them is just ark, right? Is like ark. It's like it's the ark. But how many times is the ark actually mentioned throughout the entire text, right? You can pick and choose these things. There's ones like there's whole verses or collections of verses that just don't appear in the chiasm. They've been omitted entirely. Many of them are just really, really strained. And these are the sorts of things that readers will oftentimes impose on a text. We see things that we think are there that the author never even intended to be there. I was reading an article about this recently, and someone suggested that these are maybe even just a natural way of writing, where it's a way that our brain functions when we're writing that we're not even conscious of, or reading that we're not even conscious of. So it's one of those arguments where it looks powerful and it looks convincing when you throw it up on the screen like that for 15 seconds. But when you unpack it, when you go through it, it falls apart very quickly. So the other thing that he tended to do in his video of showing internal coherence, you'll notice that I think it was like if he had like 15 individual points, I think like 10 of them were restricted Genesis 3 and 4. Now, Genesis 3 and 4 were part of the ongoing narrative that was being constructed by the Yahwist. It's the same author. Of course there's coherence and unity there. But I think it demonstrates that either, and I know that this was a surprise to me too, when I was watching your channel, you said that you saw somewhere that Jones made a statement about not even knowing what the documentary hypothesis was.
I think it was there was a guy, and I don't want to say Jones, but it doesn't sound like he really knows what it is either, because if he did, I don't know if he would be so. Then again, I mean, it's like knowing is something that you don't want to believe in. So really, you're not actually investigating with, is there validity to this for real, not confirmation bias approach, but capturing Christianity. The Cameron
Oh, okay, yeah. Bertuzzi.
He interviewed an Egyptologist, David Falk, who takes a more of a maximalist view on Egypt, the Exodus, and he said, "What is the documentary hypothesis?" And David Falk, who's not even he's not even like a biblical Hebrew scholar, he's an Egyptologist, had to explain to him why he rejects it. But he says, "Look, I don't have to accept it because I'm not a Hebrew scholar," is what he said. I'm an Egyptologist, but really, he's also a Christian. So he's like, let me avoid that documentary hypothesis thing. It sounds like this is the death blow to Christian harmonization that no one, or not just Christian, I mean, I'm sure Orthodox Jews that practice this kind of harmonious, look at the rabbis, how they've been affected. Joel Baden wrote this in his book, and Professor Joel Baden was saying, look, the rabbis have been trying to figure out this problem for a while and still keep the text to, it's so. In
very, very creative ways.
Yeah, so the Ishmaelites are in Kings. They look like these. They look like the Midianites. So technically, they're the Midianites too, or like weird stuff. That's like, really?
Oh, totally. So, but what it's what I was going to say was that those sorts of, like, if you don't know anything about the documentary hypothesis and somebody shows you that, oh, look at this total continuity that exists there in Genesis 3 and 4, that might sound convincing to someone who doesn't know anything about it. And typically what happens is when evangelicals, and when I was first presented the documentary hypothesis, I remember this is how it was presented to me, and this was kind of my reaction to it. It's presented as such an incredulous thing. It's presented as absurd in the first place. When Jones briefly talks about it in his video, he does so in the most hackneyed way possible to sort of construct this ridiculous straw man, like, well, you've got these, wherever it says Yahweh, that's a Yahweh passage, and wherever it says Elohim, that's an Elohim passage, and then you have priestly stuff, and then you have Deuteronomy, and bang, that's the documentary hypothesis. No, that's not it. That is the most simplistic, ridiculous description of the documentary hypothesis that you could possibly make. So when people come to the text with this, like, this is what the theory is, and they see something that says, wow, look at the literary artistry between Genesis 3 and 4, well, surely that must totally debunk it. So yeah. And it's something.
The same author or whoever this source is the same thing. So that doesn't. Yeah, that's ridiculous. No. I get what you're saying.
And there are large sections too throughout the Pentateuch where the same author, like I think Jay is uninterrupted from Jay runs uninterrupted from Genesis 2 through Genesis 4. Then there's a genealogy interruption there in Genesis 5. And then the flood stuff where it's mixed, but then all the way through to like Genesis 12. So there's lots of fertile ground there to show continuity and unity and artistry, right?
I think it's interesting too with Genesis 12, and you can tell me Genesis 12, and I believe it's Genesis 16. You have the same narrative being rehashed about, you're going to be a father of many nations and the blessing. Yeah. It's like, why are you saying this again? Like, didn't we hear this in the last, before the commercial break, in the last, it repeats itself. Is that two different sources?
I think so. Right. And I know Joel, like when Joel Baden put his book together, like he did a really good job of what I really liked was he said, the only thing I'm going to count as doublets in my discussion of doublets are things that are totally irreconcilable. Of course, that's not, that doesn't cover all the doublets, but what he was doing was showing, look, there's just no possible way that you can reconcile these. There's a disruption in the narrative where opposite things happen that can't possibly happen, like the naming of Beersheba is one of these, right? But the so yeah, like the Genesis 12 covenant with Abraham and the Genesis 17 covenant with Abraham are, I think, pretty clearly the same event told by these different sources, J and E. But then the redactor, whoever put them together, had to and was trying to build a consistent narrative, had to introduce this idea that, well, this is more of a covenant renewal, so it includes the name change, right? You're no longer called Abram, you're called Abraham for this reason. So, you know, we can write that off, and we can, and then the other thing that the redactor did was cleverly, very carefully put the stories together in such an order that all those places where Abraham was called Abraham are, you know, pushed to the back after this important point in the story where the name change happens. So lots of the doublets you'll find, you know, either before Genesis, you'll find before Genesis 17 and after Genesis 17, within Genesis at least, for this reason. And lots of these are ones that Baden didn't include in his book for this reason, because somebody came along and was able to reconcile them to say, yeah, this is just, you know, it happened twice, and different enough.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I said, you know, they're different enough that you go, oh wow, sure. And the one that like
you can catch that, and well, not just you, but like other scholars, that they're careful. They're going to consider that and go, I find that interesting. That yes, the redactor is trying to mend some stuff. He's not like just trying to throw hodgepodge, just slap it together. He is trying to, and I say he because we know no female was redacting these things. No. Yeah, they're combining this stuff to some degree to try and reconcile the different sources. At the same time, it's like there's some stuff that you can't quite fix. I mean, look at Genesis 38. I think it's so funny. This story about Judah comes out of nowhere, and he sleeps with his daughter-in-law. It's like, what is this doing? This now to a commercial break. Now here's why you want to wear a condom. I mean, like, it's like, what the? You know,
that's an interesting story. That one, I'm gonna go on a little bit of a tangent here. When I've taught this, when I've taught Intro to the Old Testament, I've actually pointed to that story as part of a discussion about royal propaganda. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I'm not.
Are you?
No.
Okay. So take a look at the story of Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38, and then take a look at the Davidic cycle, what's called the what are commonly called like the ascension narratives in, I think it's 2 Samuel, and it's the story essentially of David's sons. You know, first there's Absalom who tries to take the throne, and then there's is it Adonijah who rapes his sister, the sister's name, who's Tamar. But I don't have it before me, but I've done this before where. And I read a paper about this a number of years ago where somebody made a pretty compelling case that this story from Genesis 38 was like a critique of the royal family because of all this nonsense that was taking place with David's sons. You know, and there's a clear correlation between the names. You've got the same victim you know, Tamar appears in each one. Judah goes up with his friend, who's called, I believe he's called Hiram. And the strongest alliance that David and then Solomon had was with the Tyrians, whose king was Hiram. And the name of the first of Judah's sons, who failed to take up his duties and impregnate Tamar. His name is Shelah, and in Hebrew, that looks a lot like Solomon, Shalom. So, you know, there's a name correspondence that runs throughout the story, and it's a neat way of saying, you know, maybe this is a story that was told kind of tongue-in-cheek about what was going on in the palace, and, you know, it was passed down over generations, and then whoever was putting this stuff together needed, well, what do I do with this? I don't, you know, just throw it in here, because it seems to fit temporally. I don't know. So
yeah, maybe they didn't want to get rid of it. Maybe they wanted to keep it, and they
don't want to get rid of anything.
Right. And this is an interesting note. I want to make a jab at some people that I know real quick. These aren't the fundamentalist Christians that are trying to harmonize the Bible continuously with the rejection of the documentary hypothesis. But there is a group of people I will leave unnamed. Ultimately, they think that Genesis, prior to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, is really a secret code. The whole thing is a secret code for later Israel's history after the exile. Now, it's clever because, sure, there's anachronisms. Sure, like even in this narrative, let's suppose what you just said is actually the case. Then there maybe is an anachronism narrative that's taking place in the Genesis story. We know that, for example, with the Tower of Babel. If this is a ziggurat, which it may be, we have Babylon on the scene. Okay, so we're probably in the Babylonian exile when this Genesis narrative is at least taking place, at least then or after that. And I say that to say, they propose, the whole thing is just like really a secret code for later Israel's history, whereas I said, isn't it more plausible that it is narrative? It's playing a narrative of origins, you know, the creation, pre-antediluvian stuff. Like, it's really telling you a story, not suggesting it's historical, but that it's telling you a story, probably borrowing from other literary motifs, the Mesopotamian flood myths, who knows, to create and concoct a narrative, a pre-diluvian narrative, all the way down to how God chose them among all the nations of the earth. And these guys won't allow Genesis to be cosmological. They don't, because they have these other presuppositions. They think that
sure,
no non-Israelite could ever play a role in the narrative. I mean, I could go on and on. They literally go so far as to suggest that the Gentiles in the New Testament are Israelites. They cannot allow an outsider or a non-Israelite to be part of the narrative. They're part of what's called two-house theology. So anyway,
that's a new one. I was unaware of these guys.
Yeah, so, they avoid academia, it seems.
Yeah. Wow. So, but it's for a lot. I mean, the Bible kind of invites this sort of stuff too, right? Like this is, and we're conditioned to read it in a way. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog barking like crazy in the background.
Yeah, no, you're good.
My wife's
cheer for the dog. No, I'm just kidding.
My wife's a dog trainer, so we usually have like 4 or 5 here in the house. But
that's fine. No problem.
So
I don't know that, but I do have a skill you might like.
And now my Alexa is also joining the conversation.
That's awesome.
Let me mute Alexa. There we go. In order to deal with it, and this is something that I'm tired of bad apologetics.
Right.
It's been something that for a long time I have been just really, really frustrated by. I taught at a Christian university for a number of years. When I was doing my PhD, I had a position as a teaching assistant working with an apologist, teaching courses in worldview, and he had like a special seminar set up for like the best and the brightest of his students. And this is something that I found myself dealing with on a regular basis. This is a PhD theologian working at a university who's teaching undergraduate students all the way up to their fourth year really bad apologetics that don't look much different than what you see on YouTube.
Right.
You know, and there were a few points where, I mean, it drove me so crazy. I felt like I've got to say something. I've got to challenge him in on this point. I remember in one session he suggested that Hellenistic philosophy is something that developed after or you know, developed completely outside of the biblical world, and it's something we should totally reject, and it's been imposed after the fact on the biblical text. And I'm going, that is just patently false. I mean, you could see Hellenistic influences in the Bible. And he says, well, there's some of it in the New Testament. I'm like, no. Like, you could see it in the book of Daniel. You could see it in aspects of the book of Proverbs. You can see it in Ecclesiastes. I'm like, it's all over the place in there. And in another class, for a paper in a senior seminar, he wanted his students to read a paper by Stephen Meyer from the Discovery Institute about intelligent design. And I'm like, why are you propagating this nonsense when in the building next to us, the biology department is teaching evolution? Like, it just, so that's my little rant about how frustrated I have been for a very long time with bad apologetics. And my message to apologists is this: your arguments don't work. And if you want to continue in this vein, you need to come up with some better, more convincing arguments that deal with real questions that people have about Christianity and, from my perspective, about the biblical text. Because something that bad apologetics doesn't just ignore the issues with the biblical text. One of the things that it does, I think, is really robs it of what's awesome about so much of the biblical text. There's so much stuff in there that is so cool, and you're going to miss it if you're so focused on trying to keep this house of cards together in an effort to propagate this false idea of the unity of the text. So just stop it.